Hey everybody, Maxim here for another week of remote-rated essential advice. Each week, I speak with leading remote CEOs to extract practical lessons, insights, and stories to help other remote organizations and leaders drive remote transformation forward. This week, I'm lucky enough to be talking with Chris Bourdon, co-founder and CEO of With, a really interesting and really exciting telepresence startup. Chris brings a lot of interesting experience in the remote space and has a lot of interesting, really forward thinking viewpoints on this that I'm excited to dive into. So, without taking up much more time, I'll leave it to Chris to introduce himself real quick. And then, Chris, maybe a quick synopsis of what you guys are working on and what the company is all about.
Yeah. Hey, nice to be with you, Maxim. So I'm Chris. My tech career started at Apple. I was the product marketing manager for Mac OS for about 15 years. I shipped all the OS 10 releases from the first public beta to the last cat release. And one of the things that I realized while working at Apple is how important an in-person culture can be. Apple's a very in-person kind of place where the collaboration that you have in the hallway, the quick conversations you can have by knocking on the door of somebody's office are really valuable. And as COVID hit, my co-founder Laurent and I took a step back to kind of understand what kinds of things we can do to help. We realized that people were thrust apart really fast without preparation, without the tools that they needed to kind of compensate for the really unsung heroes of how we work together, being able to actually talk to people in person. And so we set about trying to think about how to solve this problem, and that's what inspired us to build with. We wanted to bring a lot of that kind of collaborative aspects of in-person working to virtual spaces.
Really, really interesting. No, and I think you're kind of uniquely positioned to have this discussion because of course you're not just trying to solve this problem for yourself, but you're trying to solve this for the people who use your product, which really nicely segues into my first question, which is, I understand your team is early stage and
Mm-hmm.
just kind of starting up in many ways, but I imagine you've run into some things figuring out how to get things booted up, how to start scaling things a little bit, and you perhaps observed in some of your partners and customers as well, kind of challenges that they've run into scaling. From your vantage point, what kind of key challenges have you observed as far as kind of getting a remote team booted up and starting to scale some practices?
Yeah, I think there's a lot here, right? When you think about it in the context of how a team that worked together in person and then became remote, there's a lot that you kind of took for granted. And I think one of the great stories that I love to tell was in the early stages of starting the company. My co-founder and I were having, we'd had a full day of work and the day was over, and we had a conversation in Telegram. And what I realized after a 90-minute, which became a tense conversation, which was not fun to have, I realized that this was something that we didn't really disagree on as much as I thought we did. And that had we just had a 10-minute conversation, that would have alleviated a lot of that misconception or misunderstanding. And so it really hit home how important synchronous conversation is. And while we're not of the position that you should only have synchronous conversation, there's rooms for all kinds of different ways of communicating. We think it's a really important, really highly efficient technique for communicating. And so when you're thinking about scaling, you have to think about how you provide the opportunity for people to interact with each other. And it starts from hiring. I think, we're used to hiring in person. We're used to having people in the office with us, or we can sit in a conference room across the way from them. We're used to having a whiteboard. We're used to having their agenda. We're used to having their resume in front of us. And now all of this is different. And is different in the remote space. So we think about how can we do that? As you're a company that's scaling, hiring is actually one of the biggest things that you do. And it's something that takes an enormous amount of time. Then once you've hired them, you're onboarding them. How do you get them onboarded in a way where you're able to disseminate your culture? We're a small team now, but as we grow and add, a couple dozen more people, hopefully in the next year, how do we take the culture that we've developed and make sure that the new people get that culture? How do you inculcate your values into the organization? And when you're remote, it's more difficult. When your team is present and you have a new employee, there's so much that they get from osmosis, just from sitting around the people that they work with. They learn the acronyms, they learn the lingo. I remember at Apple, my first probably 6 months in product marketing, I was in a lot of engineering meetings and I didn't understand half of what everyone was talking about, but I learned through the repetition and the context of those conversations what each little acronym meant. And had I not had that opportunity, I think that would have been, my learning process would have been a lot harder. So providing the opportunity for people to spend time together, even if they're distant, is really important to getting that culture piece embedded in a new organization.
Absolutely. No, it's a really interesting set of thoughts, and it kind of segues into a question that I'm curious for your thoughts on, given that you are in the process of kind of building this foundational part of your team, which is kind of in your experience and from your perspective, what traits are you really looking for, with great remote contributors? What are things on your kind of to-do list? Like, of course, all jobs have the hard skills, but there's obviously a thicket of soft skills that make the difference between a good, great, or bad remote contributor. So what things are you looking out for?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I don't know. You definitely have an added component of remoteness, right, to this. And so a remote, I think from a culture perspective, a lot of those questions are the same. And for culture, I mean mindset. How does the person think? Are they somebody who's going to need to be micromanaged, or are you going to be able to say, "Here's a problem, I need you to go solve it. Please go do that." But when you're remote, you want to make sure that a person is engaged. You want to make sure that they have the opportunity to be engaged, and that they're not. I think it's easy to hide behind tools when you have a remote workforce. You can hide behind asynchronicity. You can hide behind Slack messages and say, "Oh, well, it's not synchronous, so I don't need to respond to this." Or and there's nothing wrong with taking time to think about things to before you address them. But I think it gives people the opportunity, if you're not careful, to kind of hide away and hide behind those tools. And that's bad because the person doesn't integrate as well into the team as you need them to. But it also, I think, is for that person who's hiding behind the tools, it can be tough on them from a career perspective because they're not being seen. And that's a bigger challenge with remote, is how do you think this employee is going to proactively engage with the organization? How are they going to, and what steps are they going to take to make sure that they're involved in conversations, that they're putting their thoughts out there, that they're not just passively sitting at home because that's what the environment has allowed them to do.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great point. Certainly something I think a lot about when, we're considering bringing on a new hire, is like, how good are they at asking questions in their interviews? Because, I consider the skill of question asking is so fundamental to driving information flow. And, if someone is, as you described, proactive, they're looking to get answers to things, they're probably going to be pretty good in a remote environment. But if they're waiting to be asked, or waiting for something to prompt them to ask a question, that's going to create blockades that maybe even they're not aware of. So really
I think that's right. I mean, I love asking questions that get to the heart of a person's mindset. Are you an open, creative mindset thinker? Do you engage? What projects do you do in your free time, for example? What are your hobbies? What are they interested? What are interesting about those? Those things tell me a lot more about the kind of person that you're gonna bring on board. Of course, you need to do technical screens. Obviously, if you're hiring an engineer, you need to know that they can code. But I'm not going to do the technical screen. We have, my engineering team will do that. But I really want to know is, are you going to go and take an initiative on a project that's maybe outside the scope of what you're working on, what your direct things are? Or are you just going to be like, well, this is what's next on the list, and so this is what I'm going to do? In an early stage, I think you have a lot more room for that open mindset thinker. In later stages, it becomes more challenging. You have to hire, you need people to do things. And I think inevitably the bar lowers, but when you're in the first 30 people of an organization, and as the founders of a team, you're able to interview everybody and understand what the culture is. Everybody you hire, if they hold that culture, if they hold those values themselves, then they're going to look for that in new employees too. So that's what's important about that first group.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And of course, With is still quite a young company, but I imagine along this journey already, you've probably stumbled into a few things that maybe you would either consider doing differently or look at from a different perspective now you're further along this journey. And I'm wondering, at least as far as kind of setting up any of the remote practices or any of the things you're hiring for, on a remote team, like what would you do differently? You made kind of allusion to one interesting thing I thought, which was this observation of valuing synchronous conversation, especially in dispute resolution or disagreements. But yeah, curious if there's anything that you look upon, that you're like, I would have done that a little differently.
Yeah, that for sure is number one on my list. Every time there's a hard conversation to have, your first response, your first action shouldn't be, let me do it in Slack. It's just not, it's inefficient. There's so much that's lost in that form of communication. You can't have a jovial interaction, difficult conversation, right? You can't imbue it with personality. You can't imbue it with the ability to kind of take the heat off or add more heat. There's so many nuances that conversation gives us, from our body language to the way we say things to the specific words we use, that typing those things out is really brutal. And so every time I've relented and typed things out, I've regretted it ultimately for anything that's difficult. Certainly for institutional knowledge kinds of things, it's fine. You want to be able to write things down. You want to be able to capture them so that we can all kind of gather around them and bring our own thoughts to it. But even in the context of making those things, the pre-read has become a very common technique that teams are using to introduce ideas, to have conversations around ideas. I think it's incredibly valuable. But the pre-read, even the pre-read itself, is not going to be the best it can be without you conferring and collaborating with colleagues about what you're putting into it in the first place. So to me, I think it's very easy, particularly given that the tools that exist today are primarily asynchronous focused, right? So the Slacks of the world, the project management tools, email, even Zoom, people don't want to do lots and lots of meetings. And so Zoom is kind of getting this bad rap around that. One of the reasons why we're building With is to make a better experience for that. But, all the tools that we had were asynchronous tools. And so everything became an asynchronous conversation. And so for us, we're in a With room together during the day. We don't have to have those asynchronous conversations. We can simply slide up to each other and have those talks. And in 5 minutes, you can have something, you can resolve something that otherwise would have taken potentially hours. So to me, yes, it's very serendipitous that we're actually building a system around that. But even building it, you learn this lesson yourself, that's asynchronous communication cannot be the only way that you talk to people.
Absolutely. No, it's something that I personally find so exciting about what you guys are building also, is I think it's a under discussed cost of this constant drive for, asynchronous collaboration, which I agree with you. I think async can be a game changer, and there's a lot of areas where it can introduce efficiencies, drive document driven approaches to things that thrive in that. So it's obviously not all good or all bad, but I think one of the under discussed costs of, obsessively asyncing everything is it makes things feel lonely, and I think, Zoom conversations don't necessarily provide the proverbial vaccine for that loneliness either, where I think exactly what you guys are focused on kind of removes some of that loneliness from some of the collaborative aspects.
I think that's totally right, Maxim. I was just talking to somebody this morning who's HR lead at a very, very large company. And that was one of the biggest things they discovered from their workforce was loneliness, particularly for younger generation. Work is where, if you're moving from college, you're leaving college and going to the workforce, your next set of friends, your next set of social connections are happening at work. And so those folks pushed to home, not having that social interaction was rough. And I think it's one of the things that's inspiring these larger companies, which don't have the infrastructure for remote, to really push harder to come back to the office. Because the socialization aspect of it is we've tried to bring this, it's been one of the important tentpoles of what we're building, is to bring an informal social context to the way that you're talking and working with your teams. When people put something on your calendar to have a Zoom call, it's a meeting, right? But most of the things that you do in the office, they're not meetings. They're just casual conversations, and they're enabled because you're present with people. That's what's great about the office, is being present with people enables that kind of conversation. And so we wanted to bring that notion here. And so the socialization and being able to provide a way for people to have that is important. I don't want to, the virtual world will never replace people being together in person, and people should always find out how to do that. If you're a remote only team, you should be making sure that you're able to get together at least a couple of times a year with people. It's just so valuable and so enriching that no matter how much remoteness you embrace, it's important to have that social context to your work as much as it's just, work.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think if there's anything our conversation is a strong reminder of for me, it's this idea that, we're in this phase of invention and phase of figuring things out as far as this transformation is concerned goes, where it's stimulating a lot of kind of very binary and kind of quasi-religious viewpoints, where it's like
That's
you're
right.
either synchronous or async, you're either full remote or, you're in the office. It's like, yeah, in many cases, there truly is that kind of compromise that maximizes the positives of both. And I
Mhm.
think that's something very cool that, it seems With is really looking to harmonize, which is so exciting.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot, and you've probably seen this too. A lot of companies are embracing the hybrid model for work, right? Where they're reducing the kind of required number of days in the office, allowing people to have more flexibility in how they decide to engage. Um, and I know this is a hot topic in the remote work world as well. And I wonder, and I'm curious because we're going to learn how it works out and how people implement it. But you've got this kind of two-sidedness of you've got fully remote and fully in office, and now you've got this middle piece where there's a lot of inefficiency introduced because you have to tool for remote and tool for in-person. You still have to have all the same real estate. So you're not necessarily getting the best of both worlds, of either world. In this new world, I'm curious, I think hybrid is obviously going to be a really important topic over the next couple of years as people live through hybridness, in the office 3 days a week, at home 2 days a week, or vice versa, how people are going to coordinate their schedules across the hybrid workflow so that if we're doing collaboration in person, well, that means we have to be together in person. We have to time our lives together again. So much of what we kind of realized was very powerful about being remote is going to get clawed back here. And I'm wondering, you probably, I think this is an interesting topic. I'm curious as to how other people are seeing hybrid evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's going to be interesting to see, and I think one of the common concerns I always see with hybrid structures, which I would tend to agree with, is this risk it introduces to create kind of like this almost like two-tiered society, where you've got,
Mhm.
your employees who are in the office every day, getting these serendipitous interactions, getting the kind of results of that and keeping that amongst themselves. And then you kind of have the remote contributors who are off on, Slack or Zoom all the time and creating their own kind of projects and
Mhm.
microculture as a consequence of that. And I think certainly the risk of hybrid, from my perspective, is the schism that can introduce. But I tend to agree with everything you've said also, which is likely the winning formula is going to have some kind of hybrid approach where you are getting the positives of both those in-person interactions. You're presenting flexibility for people. You're creating that kind of mothership element of
Yeah.
things where there's a single source of truth and there is kind of
Yeah.
a real home for the company. Um, yeah,
I wonder if it's it's important to be purposeful with why you bring people to the office. I think going to the office used to just be this, that's what we did. You went at 9, you left at 5, you were in the office. You were accountable because you were there, right? That was part of your job performance, was to be there. But if we became more purposeful about why we went to the office, what brought us there to the physical space together? So, well, it isn't necessarily just to go and hang out and to just do your regular day. If you're purposeful about what you're accomplishing there together, I think that will help make that model more successful.
yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think from my vantage point, one of the more kind of coherent and innovative approaches I've seen to this is the leadership that Dropbox has displayed, where they were initially introducing this kind of hybrid model, ran into a lot of criticism for many of the things that I mentioned, and then they decided, okay, let's reevaluate this again and reposition all of our physical locations as kind of like these innovation studios and collaboration studios, and they've been really prescriptive about how they're using that asset. So for instance, they've made it clear like these spaces are not for solo work. Like you don't show up there as an individual contributor, throw headphones on and
Right.
jam on work.
Right.
These are places where if you want to do a creative workshop with your colleagues, that's where you
Mhm.
go do it. Or you want to have a meeting with customers or prospects and pull them in to show them, presentations or give them the swag and,
Mhm.
show them all the collateral. Like here's where you do that. Um, so I think like that's one model I'm particularly keen to pay attention to the long-term impacts of. Like let's see how Dropbox does it, because
Yeah.
I think that might be the right recipe. We'll see.
I think it's great to see leadership from a company that size.
Yeah.
Traditionally, companies, they've invested in real estate, they've invested in certain workflows. They have just an institutional resistance to those kinds of changes and adaptions, and that take a long time to do. So it's great to see a company that size really thinking longer term.
Yeah, no, I've been incredibly impressed by them. So one question I always like to kind of pull things in towards the end is something super duper practical, which is kind of drilling in on what's your, what's kind of on your personal tech stack or workflows, on any given week. I love to find out.
Sure.
In some cases it's just the kind of garden variety stuff, but sometimes people have interesting tools they've run into that have been game changers for them. I'm curious what kind of things are kind of on your essentials list for a week in the life of.
This is a better question for my co-founder, who's a tools junkie.
Yeah.
The number of tools that we've tried out and tested is impressive, and he particularly really appreciates the newer kinds of the smaller companies trying to make meaningful change into the tool space. So we are for me, the most important tool that I use is the way that I write. And writing, I think, as we've talked about with asynchronous and just being able to communicate your message is important. And so, and writing is about focusing. And I'm sure I'm not going to say something that everybody doesn't experience, but it takes me a while to get the gear going to stop distracting myself with other things to do and to sit down and really think about how I'm going to write something, what I'm going to say. So I really like having a great tool to write in. I like Bear right now for writing. It's got all the support that I need. It allows me to full screen it and take everything away. So I'm a big fan of Bear. And it's been my go-to for a while for just basic writing. I've been a fan of Agenda for a while as well. I think it might be a Mac app only, I'm not sure, but it has iOS versions too. Agenda is another great tool for collecting your writings and your daily work. And particularly if you're somebody who likes to kind of write every day about your day. And the UI is fantastic. It's just really well done. We obviously are a with team. We use with a lot. So assuming that with is a big part of our day, we do use Slack. We don't have very many channels, and we tend to try to keep it to institutional knowledge kinds of things and not real-time conversation. It's very, very poor for real-time conversation, I think. But I think that's what unfortunately, it's a tool that's not great for real-time conversation that people use for real-time conversation. And so we use it, but we try to avoid it for real-time stuff. For bug tracking, we use an app called Height, another one of these kind of smaller tools. I think if you're a startup, you should absolutely be looking at other startups to see what interesting things they're doing, and we really liked Height. Height also embeds really nicely in a with room, so we can take our Height board, we can put it right in a with room right next to us, so we can have it live in real time. So that's very nice. We do use Notion to capture a lot of our institutional knowledge there too. But I think I wouldn't say that my other tools are photography. I like to take pictures, and so I was just on a vacation and went through probably 4 or 5 different editing workflows to see which one of them worked better for me. So I would say I'm a photography tools junkie more than anything else. Discovering Halide Camera and Darkroom and Lightroom, those have been kind of my go-tos of the last few days. So I like tools, but I try to not to have too many of them.
Absolutely. I know those are some good call outs that I'll be excited to take a look at for myself.
Yeah, please.
So the last question I have, is whether you were giving, advice to one of your kids, or a recent college grad, or maybe even just a worker who is coming from, a purely office life to first time as a remote, contributor or remote leader. What would be kind of one piece of advice that you would give, to any of those people, starting their remote journey and looking to be effective at either just collaborating or even managing people?
I think it's about keeping in touch and making sure that you are putting into the team, that you are making the team more than just, yourself better. How are you going to go and engage from a professional way, from a culture? How do you make the team more interesting? How do you make your day more interesting? How do you make it so a place your colleagues want to come and work with you? There's a lot of, if you're a manager, I think making sure that you're keeping in touch with everybody on a one-on-one basis is really important. It's something that I think you can't kind of overestimate enough, and I've relied on other people to do more than I have in the past. And I think that if I was to kind of improve an area for myself, it's more of that one-to-one kind of communication and relationship. I've worked with people in the past who've done a great job with that, and then I've leaned on them to help me with that. But I think that means a lot, right? People don't. There's an adage, right? People don't leave jobs because they don't like the job or the company. They leave because they don't like their manager. And so having a really great relationship with people on your team is important. And whatever the right tool is for that, you should use it. But it means having one-on-ones, means making sure that you understand from a personal development how you're developing that person, right? I heard this really great anecdote, story once from a guy who works for a very large finance organization, and he told me that their one-on-ones, when they have them, they don't talk about work. One-on-ones are for personal development. They're for your team's personal development. So rather than coming into a one-on-one and talking about, oh, here's specific technical problem that I have if you're an engineer, like that time should be for personal development. What are you struggling with? Do you have a relationship issue on the team with somebody? Do you feel like somebody's not carrying their weight, or hey, how can we get you to up? So I think that those kinds of conversations are underserved for the most part within organizations. So I think the emotional aspect, the emotional quotient, the EQ of being a manager is really important. Understanding what drives your people and drives your team.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, and really kind of good sage advice there. Well, we're at about half an hour here, so really great conversation, Chris, that sped on by, and I'm incredibly grateful for your time today. So I think with that we can call this adjourned. Before we do, where can any viewers and listeners find you guys, and feel free to kind of give your company a
yeah, sure. Well, I've enjoyed our time, Maxim. Thank you so much for hosting this. It's been a really great conversation. We're at with.so. Go there, sign up. Signups are open. It's really great particularly if you're a team lead or a team manager and you want to be able to have that connection with your team. It's a great way to have that, whether you just have office hours where your team can all spend time together and be present with one another, to have those serendipitous kinds of conversations that were really important about the office, or whether you want a much more fun place to have meetings instead of Zoom. Our spot is very cool and very fun to be in, and it's much more informal and casual, but it's got really great features, having spatial audio, being able to save things that you put them in the room and they're there the next time you come back, having fun wallpapers, being able to turn your camera on and off and be an avatar, just much more fun and engaging, but also lets you be even more productive than you'd be in a Zoom call. So with.so, please come and sign up and give it a try.
Fantastic. With.so. Well, thanks so much, Chris. And certainly to all of you listening, thank you as always for tuning in and for joining us and for being a part of this conversation. Be sure to join me next week for the next episode of RemoteRated Essential Advice, where we'll keep this going, keep finding interesting lessons, interesting tools, tips, and advice to help all of us drive this remote transformation forward and do it better and with less stress. So thanks again for your time, and we'll see you next week.